Is the progressive left wrong about Britain's ethnic minorities? To help answer this question, I'm joined by thinker and author Dr. Rakib Ehsan. Welcome, Rakib.
Thank you for having me, William.
Great. Well, you've written a new book, which I have here, called Beyond Grievance. And the premise of the book, obviously, is that the left get quite a few things wrong. So what are the main things they get wrong?
William, they get many things wrong.
Yeah.
That's the truth of it. I think what I really wanted to do with the book is really challenge what I'd consider to be quite problematic liberal left narratives surrounding the life of many of our ethnic minority communities. I think too much of it's been overly doom and gloom. There's been a great deal of talk about how ethnic minorities, they live in a fundamentally racist society, they're alienated from our economic, social and cultural systems. That is simply not rooted in reality. So I really wanted to challenge those myths, which are, in my view, a threat to social cohesion in the country at large.
It's made things worse, isn't it? A lot of these narratives are very negative, very divisive, and your book actually is pretty full of facts, aren't they? So wherever we go, so let's start. Britain is a fundamentally racist society, that's claimed, and that's hammered all the time. And yet, the first question I would say, well, okay, there are racists in every society, but compared to what? So if I asked you, how does Britain compare with other Western liberal democracies?
Well, I'd say that, to be honest, I think Britain fares very well. I think there's that myth that Britain is a bigoted island and then the EU is an oasis of tolerance. That's simply not the case. It's absolutely ludicrous. If you look at the provision of anti-discrimination protections, for example, on the grounds of race, ethnicity, religion, Britain comfortably outperforms major EU member states such as France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain and Italy. And I think we are a country of considerable religious freedoms. Now, I think it's very important that those freedoms are not exploited and taken advantage of. But I think that one of the great things for many British Muslims, for example, and hopefully we'll come on to that later when we're talking about their integration, political incorporation, is that they're allowed to practice their faith in a meaningful and wholesome way, which is certainly not the case for their co-religionists in other countries such as France. We have a very militant secularism, which in my view is quite oppressive when it comes to religious practice.
And that, we'll go into it a bit later, but that means that a lot of people that are free to practice their religion in this country do appreciate it, and it's not taken for granted because many of the states that they come from, that's not a given. So I don't. When I scanned your book, I think it's a great book. I agree with virtually everything in it. But I think when I scanned it, I thought, there's so many areas that the progressive left are wrong about. They're, literally sowing things that have no basis in fact. So as you say, the comparison with this country in Europe, some of the narratives that came around in the time of Brexit were ludicrous. And we're not, the Cable saying that Brexit was based on white nostalgia, or David Lammy comparing the ERG to Nazis.
And apartheid South Africa as well.
Yeah, this is utterly crazy. Unbelievable. But the biggest thing recently, the biggest problem recently, is the importation of American sort of hyper-racialized politics, isn't it? And that's like the BLM wave. It's like a sort of wave that washed over the country.
Absolutely.
And it was disappointing because we lapped it up, and the Anglosphere lapped it up comprehensively. But you're a proud Lutonian, aren't you? So what the heck does this narrative have to do with you in Luton?
Well, I think for me it's a real problem in terms of this brainless importation. That's what I call it in the book, of this racial identity politics, which the US exports very aggressively to the rest of the Anglosphere. To the point where you had British BLM demonstrators chanting "Don't shoot" at British police officers. Our police forces are largely unarmed, and they support that model of policing, the vast majority of the profession. But what it is for me, I think, when you look at theories such as white privilege, it has no usefulness in terms of understanding ethnic and racial disparities in the UK. Because as you know, this is something that you've talked about, if you look at educational outcomes, for example, and this is where intersectionality, it does provide some value, because if you look at the outcomes for white working class boys, desperately poor, especially in the northwest of England. And I think when you're looking at privilege, for me, this is something that I talk about in the book. I think the greatest advantage that you could have in life is belonging to a stable and loving family home.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a theme and again, I want to discuss that later and separately because it's such a big thing. But yeah, I mean, concepts like white privilege they're advanced in the academy, and then they get into culture, you know, and into media.
Absolutely.
But if you're a white working class lad in Hartlepool, it's a joke to say that, to say that you have some privilege. I mean, particularly from a class point of view, one of the criticisms I have with it is it just takes class off the table.
Absolutely.
Do you agree?
Absolutely, and I think that, you know, much of the left ignores the fact that there are significant class-based barriers within British society. We should be honest about that. The Social Mobility Commission, its poll in 2019 found that 77% of British people thought the gap between classes was too large. More than 3 in 4 people in the country are not rabid Marxists. I imagine there's traditional Tories within that 77%. So I think it's worth talking about class a little bit more and looking at how areas of deprivation, how they lack the opportunities for young people to maximise their potential.
Certainly politically, I've noticed leading the SDP, it's very claret and chips. We're a very broad party. You know, in London it's quite cerebral, and in the regions it's very working class in parts. And that whole narrative, trying to get you know, SDP members from sort of West Yorkshire and the North East to see themselves as privileged. They would just say, you know, our ancestors, you know, lost limbs in the mines, you know, and were treated appallingly, actually. So it doesn't have any sort of basis in reality.
Absolutely.
So the heart of the problem in terms of the divisiveness is that some people are trying to get Britain's ethnic minorities to believe that the system is entirely rigged against them, that the institutions and the society itself is institutionally racist or systemically racist. And that's a major problem. It's just negative and untrue, isn't it?
It's hugely untrue, I think, and that narrative that our systems are deliberately rigged against ethnic and racial minorities. And you don't see much evidence of that when you look at the outcomes. For example, educationally, it's actually ethnic minority communities, especially pupils of Chinese and Indian origin, are performing incredibly well in schools in more urban parts of England. And I think when you look at our public institutions, if you look at politics, trade unions, business confederations, there are ethnic minority individuals rising through the ranks.
Yeah, well, the Prime Minister is...
Well, quite.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that the idea is deliberately rigged. Now, of course, we can make improvements in terms of equality of opportunity, but I think the two main issues there is, as you say, social class and region. We're one of the most interregionally imbalanced economies in the industrialised world. So I think that if we're looking at what shapes advantage and privilege, we need to look more at class and region, in my view.
I think that's right, and the data says it's right, but I just want to dig a little bit further on in terms of the damaging aspects of this narrative, because what I see is that if you peddle the idea that racial or community disparities are attributable to racism primarily, if you say that, you've got to say, well, who is responsible for racism? And of course, the white majority. You're going to think, what are they talking about us? Is it our fault? Are we to blame for these different disparities? And as you say, it's not just in education, it's not just in economic performance. There are certain minority groups that really massively outperform. You know, you say in the book, the Chinese and the British Indian population, they earn at a much higher rate than the average, and they manage to accumulate wealth at a higher rate.
Very strong emphasis on home ownership, for example.
Exactly. Yeah. So and immediately culture comes into it. So the outcomes to any sane person looking at it, dispassionately, it has to say, well, now the cause of Indian or Hindu outperformance you might want to look at the Hindu community.
No, absolutely. I think the role of faith, multi-generational cohesion, wisdom and knowledge being passed down the generations.
Yeah.
I think that's something that's probably been lost a little bit in the white British mainstream.
Oh, massively.
Perhaps.
Totally. No, and I certainly think there are some things about family, extended family and community and rootedness that the majority white community can learn from Britain's ethnic minorities. No doubt about that. But as I say, I think it's not only an incorrect narrative, it's poisonous, because white people are going to think, well, it's as if the white majority are sort of pulling strings and get, the Bangladeshi person, going to keep them down, or keep this, or keep the Hindus up. No, I mean, you could. I mean, in theory, I would accept in theory that Chinese and Hindus could be, and probably are, subject to some racism, and you could argue that they would have done even better. But I don't think the disparity is explained by the majority.
No,
I just don't.
I think cultural values count for a great deal. Emphasis on family unity, thinking of yourself as more than just a mere individual. And I think some of those beliefs are more strongly held in certain groups than others in society. Also, when you're looking at ethnic minority outcomes, you have to look at migratory background. Some people bring more resources with them, business acumen, when they come to the UK. Other people may come from very deprived rural regions, so it might take a bit more time for them to integrate and make progress.
No, but I think that's such a big, a very important point, because again, when you're looking at different groups, and you can chop groups up into very small component parts in the end, but if you're looking at groups, certainly migration into the West from parts of Africa is really quite, I mean, if you look at Nigerian Americans, for instance, massively outperforming. But they're taking very, very motivated, bright. They're taking the best, because it's quite a high bar. So again, you're going to get disparities. I mean, my take on it is that I don't think these disparities are going to go rapidly. You want to aim for equality, but I don't think they're going to go. And so the only way we can get on in a multi-ethnic, multi-faith, diverse society is to have a greater level of honesty, and I would say maturity about some of these things.
There has to be honesty, and maturity goes a long way. And certain communities clearly have to be very honest within themselves about why they may not be performing as well as other compared to other groups.
But that's hard, isn't it? I mean,
it's very difficult.
Do you think? I mean, obviously, human beings are not. It's much harder to look at yourself. Your book is stuff full of brilliant stats, evidence-based. But you've got some of the disparities. So school, I wrote a few down. School exclusion rate, Black Caribbean kids 10.7%, Chinese 0.6%. There are different groups in between. The big one, and it is hard, because you don't want to. You've got to be fair, but you also got to be honest.
Absolutely.
And children raised by single parents, Black Caribbean 63%, Indian 6%. That's an order of magnitude. That's massive. And
they would all fall under BAME, by the way.
I know.
Which shows how homogenising it is.
We could talk about. I mean, I think BAME is just insulting nonsense. I don't even believe. I don't even believe that the black community is a thing.
Absolutely.
Do you agree?
There's very serious differences between. Firstly, the Black African category is incredibly diverse. That could include established migrants of Christian faith originating from Nigeria, or more recently arrived refugees who follow the Islamic faith. Originating from the Horn of Africa, maybe Eritrea or Somalia.
You're quite right. I mean, the Ghanaian immigration into the UK, 56, was quite professional. And I was taught by a brilliant teacher in my school from Ghana. That's a different thing to people fleeing persecution from war-torn places. Yeah, I just think we've just got to be honest. I love the honesty that you've put into the book, and I think, so just to finish this sort of part of it, it's clear, isn't it? It's absolutely clear to anyone that's fair, is that there are massive disparities. The disparities aren't going to go away very, very quickly. And to attribute disparities between groups in diverse societies to some broad theory of systemic racism and is just untrue. The real things are cultural attitudes, family stability.
Absolutely, and I didn't write the book deliberately seeking to offend particular groups. If you genuinely care about young British black lives, you'll talk about family structure and the reality of up to the age of 15, Black Caribbean children, 63% living in lone parent households. And it's not to stigmatise single parents either. Many do try their utmost under very difficult circumstances to provide their children with a proper upbringing. That is bound to have that's bound to shape outcomes surrounding mental well-being, cognitive development, level of education attainment, further down the line, labour market integration, in adulthood. It really does, cognitive development as well.
Well, let's get on to it, because one of the we can't talk about every single chapter in the book, but a brilliant chapter in the book is about family and the importance of family to many ethnic minority communities who are getting it right. Some have more challenges, but a lot of them are getting it absolutely right. And I think the term you use, which is something, you're in good company, Rakib, because I have the same problem. You say that anyone defending the traditional family, even the mildest defence, that's the word you use, the term, you come under attack. Why is that?
I think the family is seen by some elements of the left as a very hierarchical institution. Well,
patriarchal.
You need a bit of hierarchy. That's the truth of it. I'm sorry. I think I have a natural respect for my elders. I have a respect for my parents. I get along with my parents incredibly well. I do, but I understand where the authority lies within my family structure.
It's quite moving, actually, that you mentioned your mum and you mentioned the wider community. And
absolutely.
And growing up in that place, it's a feeling of safety. And it's a
strong sense of belonging.
Yeah.
But I actually say in the book a little bit of pressure as well.
Of course.
I want to represent the family very well. When I'm out in the community and people ask me, "Oh, Rakib, how did you do in your exams? How are you doing at university? How are you progressing in terms of your career? How's work going?" You don't want to bring bad news, and you don't want to bring shame to your family and the wider community.
No, and also when you do well, you're also representing your family, your community in Luton, aren't you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Luton does not have the best reputation. That's the truth of it.
No, but it's interesting. I mean, that's why I was mentioning BLM being important. It has no place at all. Every local area is different, and Britain's very different. But I just think I think it's odd, because I get challenged, let's put it that way, sometimes for sticking up for the family. And the SDP has a separate policy section specifically on the family, and we have some very strong pro-family policies, like full sharing of tax allowances between married or couples raising children. That's a massive thing. When you explain it to British people, in the regions, I think, that would help immensely. I mean, if we're not going to pay any, if we're raising kids, the couple's not going to pay any tax until there's 26 grand in the bank. That's going to help us a lot, and it may mean that there's less pressure on childcare. Maybe dad looks after the kids, or mum, But and there's another policy we have, which is that giving married couples preference in housing allocations, and again, quite. In the present climate, it seems quite edgy, or a bit spicy to have a policy like that. But we believe in it, and I would argue that all the quantitative research in social science supports family stability and so on. So, as I say, we're unless you're. Do you think our opponents in this, Rakib, are being? Is it a moral failure?
Oh, it's.
Is it dishonest?
It's dishonesty. I think that comes into it. And people say, successful families come in different shapes and sizes. That's not the argument that we're making. What I'm saying through the book is that there's certain family structures which are more strongly associated with positive youth outcomes and young people's personal development. Yes. And the evidence is there.
Yeah.
And I think that when you're looking at tendencies on the modern left, there is very much a tendency to be overly inclusive. And the reality is what we need to focus on is what works better.
And what works better, again, this is interesting that you phrase it that way, because when I look at social science, I mean, I'm a philosopher and town planner by training, but when I look at social science, you have to look at populations. Yes, of course there are exceptions, but pretty much on the population level, the quickest route to family poverty is single parenthood. It just is.
It is.
And in terms of good outcomes for society and for children and parents, the wider community, solid family structure, there's just no. Do you think that a lot of the progressives that we're talking about are actually hypocrites on them, particularly the ones towards the top of the social hierarchy, the tendency to speak liberal constantly and act conservative.
Oh, there's a huge hypocrisy there.
Yeah.
They're people who are responsible for condemning, in my view, very sensible, conservative thinking, living quite socially conservative lives themselves. The kind of politician that says, you know, successful families can come in all shapes and sizes, but they have a very conventional family history.
Or drugs, you know, the attitude, you know, it's a permissive attitude of drugs, it's fine,
Exactly.
but you're not practicing that. You wouldn't want your kids doing that.
No, absolutely. If they found that their own children were taking drugs, they wouldn't be very pleased. But they seem to be very happy about the liberalisation of drugs.
Yeah.
I think you should really, in a sense, if you personally believe that your own lifestyle provides a solid model, then that should also be reflected in your own policy thinking. That's what I feel.
Yeah, I mean, you know, obviously, we some politicians. I mean, you know, famously, the previous Prime Minister Boris Johnson, you know, massively liberal, and actually, I would argue that the way he lived his life and the way he did public policy was aligned, because everything he did was liberal. So there was no problem there from the point of view of hypocrisy.
He's very much a free spirit, put it that way.
Yeah. You mentioned, I mean, I don't talk about the Labour Party too much, because we're building our own party, which I think is a separate thing, but a lot of the book is about the Labour Party and its problems with Britain's ethnic minorities. Labour has had a sort of patriotic makeover, a sort of rebranding, hasn't it? During Brexit, you know, the primary opponent to getting Brexit done was Starmer. He did everything he could to
Chief architect of the second referendum policy.
Yeah, to try and stop it. He did everything he could, and then suddenly, you know, I think Kate Ainsley was appointed, and then a few other advisors, and it's, oh well, you can't do a press conference without having a British flag behind you, and it's absurd to me. So that's one thing, they do that. I'm not sure if people buy it, but what are the chances of the Labour Party having a sort of pro-family makeover? You know, do you see anything like that happening?
I'm naturally a very optimistic person.
I know,
so,
I know.
And I think in a sense it provides a golden opportunity for Labour to reconnect with many of its traditional-minded core voters, in a sense. But I think the issue is, and this is my worry, that in recent times when it comes to social policy, there's been too much of an emphasis on protected characteristics. Yeah. Which, as you know, social class is not a protected characteristic in our equalities legislation. In terms of a pro-family makeover, I do think Sir Keir is well positioned to lead that kind of agenda because of his own lifestyle, in a sense, which is actually quite a conventional family and marital history that he has, background. In terms of the chances of it, I think the circle of advisors are of a better quality, certainly more so than the Corbyn era. There's no two ways about that. And I think that the thinking that should exist on the left is actually, if you have stronger families, you actually, in some ways, you really present or create opportunities to reduce welfare spending. That is the truth.
No, of course, because the family is the first line of defence.
Absolutely, and I think in a way, if you have stronger families, the welfare state becomes more sustainable as a result of that. But I think, for me, cohesive societies ultimately rely on the existence of strong and stable families.
I agree with you, but I'm not optimistic about the Labour Party doing it. But it's not, I mean, Starmer may believe it, but his membership and his wider membership, and a lot of his progressive voters, because if you look at who votes Labour now, you know, so what Matt Goodwin would call the new elite, and their wider groups, the 15-20% of people that is the core of that, the most activist, and they're not getting it at all. No. And so if I get chopped for just telling the truth about, in a good faith way, about family structure, I can't see it anytime soon. There's a great chapter in this book about patriotism, and in particular the patriotic feelings that many ethnic minority communities have. Would you like to just outline that? Because I wasn't surprised about it, because I've read about it before. But do you think the level of patriotism there is underrated, underreported?
Oh, definitely. And I think that many of the mainstream narratives surrounding patriotism, I mentioned a number of commentators in the book who said that very dubiously, that if Labour was to embrace symbols of Britishness and were to take a more patriotic route through its activities, this would alienate ethnic minorities en masse, which is
why would it?
Which is quite clearly nonsense. There are first-generation migrants originated from very unstable and indeed dangerous environments in their countries of origin. So naturally they have positive orientations towards British democracy. Now their children and grandchildren, they may have different expectations of British democracy because they very much have an exclusive frame of reference. But the idea that if you were to have a more patriotic Labour Party, that this would alienate ethnic minority voters across the country, there's no evidence of that whatsoever. And I think there's also the evidence, and I'll just make this point very quickly as well, with Brexit, you saw Brexit votes being delivered in areas with very high South Asian origin populations, including Luton. 56.5%, I think Bradford voted out. The predominantly Asian parts of Birmingham are also quite, how would you say, higher than expected votes there as well.
It sort of links into, I mean, so I'll just, the stats in here, so I'll say it for the viewers. So the question of whether British identity is important to you, ethnic minorities 68%, the white population is 63%. I think the slightly lower figure in the white population may be, to some extent, which you flag up, might be a sense of Englishness rather than Britishness or Scotsness or
so like a Scottish only, English only, Welsh only identity.
But it's still the vast majority, over 2/3 of ethnic minorities, British identity is important to them. And I totally agree with you. I mean, the SDP, we maybe get onto this in the sort of solutions section of this interview later, but we propose a mass immigration pause or to end mass immigration. For absolutely good faith reasons. We need to find a new us in this country. We need to bring people together and have a pause and take a breather. And rampant, reckless levels of migration are just not helpful for that. So we've got a lot of ethnic minority members in the SDP who get it, and they think for themselves. And yet, progressives constantly say, we can't think that. Isn't that just insulting?
It's insulting. It's also very contradictory to say that Britain is a fundamentally racist country, but you're supportive of very high levels of immigration. So why would you support lots of non-white people coming to the country and suffer this so-called aggressive racism? It's not consistent at all. But I totally agree with you on immigration. And if you actually see parts of the country that believe that immigration is currently too high, it's not exclusively held by the Tory voting provinces. There's also a common view in what I call Labour's Asian origin heartlands as well.
Oh, totally, yeah. And as I say, anyone paying attention, I mean, it also, it shouldn't be, in terms of people's life stories, it shouldn't be surprising if you come to Britain, which is a stable, well-organised state, and you come from a place that is failing and is divided and a war-torn zone. Chaotic. You'd be very cautious about protecting what we have here.
No, absolutely. I'd make the point, if there's someone who came to Britain, relocated as a refugee, who genuinely fled persecution and violence in their country of origin, why would they express sympathy with irregular migration on the English South Coast?
Insane.
The small boats. Imagine, you may argue that they may be more sensitive to it more than anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think they'd totally be alive to it, and I think, but what I'm getting at that. I mean, obviously the patriotism is there in the vast majority, but what I'm getting at also is the patronising attitude.
Indeed.
That a lot. I mean, you say these awful terms. What you call in the book left racism, Uncle Tom's, coconuts, race traitors, white adjacent. That's so insulting. I mean, my own family has a number of different ethnic groups in it. We're mainly white, but not entirely. If I said to members of my family, "You're white," you're trying to take away someone's achievement. You're trying to say that they are themselves. Absolutely, so insulting to say that.
It really is
unbelievable. Now the book. So that's the majority. I totally agree with you. And if I was going to be in a fight, I'd want a lot of these people behind me. But I think the white progressives a lot of them are very anti-patriotic, very hostile to the idea of nation states. But there's also sizable minorities that have very anti-Western views, and it's interesting. The book came out. You are an optimist. I mean, there's a lot of optimism in this book, and I sort of agree with. I agree with it in the main, in that I think if you take the race baiters out, you take the grievance industry out, you take CRT out, and you take all this stuff out.
Which won't be easy, by the way, because it's very much embedded in our institutions. Also, I think I'm understanding the challenges involved.
That's the final part of the interview, what we do. But it is very difficult. But I've no doubt at all that you take that out, and ordinary British people of various backgrounds have no difficulty at all in getting on with each other. That's just what I see. But you wrote the book before October the 7th.
Indeed.
And at the in the book, I think the sort of worst recent example of inter-community trouble was Leicester, and that was bad, but it wasn't huge in scale. I know people came in from Birmingham and so on. It was pretty unpleasant.
London as well. Yeah.
Pretty unpleasant, but I think I have to say, October the 7th changes things, and then you get massive demonstrations on streets, and Jewish kids not being able to go to school. Today it was reported that buses refused to collect Jewish kids on the way to school, and so suddenly the whole atmosphere has changed. Do you agree?
Well, I think that when you look at the Israel-Palestine conflict, there's no doubt that it has the potential, and it is having an impact on social cohesion, especially more urban parts of the country. Now, I'd make this point. I think there's perfectly legitimate grievances to be raised in terms of the Israeli government's militaristic occupation and forms of population displacement in the West Bank. Where I take issue is that British Jews being treated as agents almost of the Israeli government. That's not on. Now, ultimately, we support a very inclusive model of patriotism, tying together a variety of faiths and indeed none. And I think I've been very worried about some of the language and some of the behaviour, to be honest, at some of the demonstrations. It's very clear that there's been anti-Semitic chanting, the displaying of pro-terror paraphernalia. And I think that actually weakens the pro-Palestine cause more than anything when that kind of behaviour is shown on mainstream media outlets.
It does, and you don't know how. I mean, I've been in town when some of the demonstrations have been on. I haven't been on them, but I've witnessed them, and and there's been a lot talked about. You don't know how many of the 200,000 people that turn up are saying these things or doing these things, but certainly a sizable minority. But and multiculturalism, has been under threat intellectually for a long time now. Particularly the sort of what we would call it, sort of indifferent multicultural, just get on with it, nothing, just live your own life in separate communities, gated communities, or whatever. That's the bit. But I think I am concerned that the test of whether it works out isn't when things are fine. It's when something like Israel-Palestine kicks off.
Absolutely.
And I do worry. And when I see, Jewish people saying how much I can live here, it's terrifying.
No, and I think that's something that needs to be urgently addressed. I think the Met, in particular, in terms of the policing, the protests, very much found wanting, in my view. And it's something that I talk about in the book. The real issue here is that in many of our public institutions, they're tribal activists who have been given a great deal of power and influence within those institutions. In some cases, our anti-extremism funding has been allocated to organisations where the leadership appear to express sympathy with the Taliban in Afghanistan.
It's astonishing.
So we need systems-level change. We really do.
It's been the centre has been so weak in this. I mean, if we have a membership of a few thousand. If you want to join the SDP, we check you out. We check you out. We don't reject many people, but if we can find one or two that are not going to get into our party, how is it that the police end up, as you say, funding and appointing people that have said things that are terrible?
I think it's awful, and I think that's one of the fundamental flaws with multiculturalism as an integration policy approach, that it gives far too much influence to self-appointed community leaders who are anything but representative of the communities.
And they are, come
from.
It is a major problem. They are sort of there are so many of them as well, and they take it upon themselves to represent people, but they haven't asked them.
No,
have they?
And it's even to the point that in some parts of the country, our law and order responsibilities have been outsourced to these community leaders, which is incredibly reckless. And I think you can see the consequences of that. You can clearly see that with the large-scale public disorder last year in Leicester as well.
It isn't. I mean, I wouldn't. You know, I think the police. I think they are practicing two-tier policing. We saw that in the lockdown, because the BLM protests were not. BLM major protests took place when you could only assemble 6 people at once.
Yeah, some police officers taking the knee as well.
Yeah, which is wrong. You know, and Starmer made a big mistake on that. You know, BLM. Just look at it. Ben Cobley did a lovely piece for us in SDPtalk, and I did another piece after that about it. All you had to do with BLM was read what they actually said, and you know, defunding police, anti-family, anti-free enterprise. So no, it's insane. It is going to be a challenge though, and I think the diversity is strength narrative, which is peddled constantly, it can be, but it can also be a massive challenge, and it's sometimes a weakness. So I've got a quote here. You say, diversity is only a strength if it is tied together by shared values, mutual obligations, and a sense of common purpose. I agree with you. The problem is that both of us have to face reality on.
Of course.
Is that some groups, you know, say a jihadi or an Islamist extremist, does not share the values of a secular Democrat. So what do we do?
Naturally, extremists fall outside of that, and I think we have to be honest. I have quite a strong counter-extremism background. It's something I've talked about with Prevent. There's such a huge difference between the ideological character of referrals to Prevent and the country's actual wider terror threat picture, which is very much jihadist dominated. You wouldn't think that looking at the ideological composition of referrals to Prevent. And I think the issue there is that we unfortunately have many progressive leaning public institutions in education and healthcare who are involved in Prevent, in that referral system, who are perhaps fearful of being accused of being racist, Islamophobic.
But you know, progressives complain about Prevent and say it's causing problems, and most Muslims aren't even aware of it.
Most British Muslims are not even aware of Prevent. They say that British Muslims are being alienated en masse by Prevent. How an entire group can be alienated en masse by a programme they don't actually know by name is a very interesting take. And actually, to be honest, if you really want to see some of the most robustly conservative law and order positions, you can visit quite a good number of British Muslim communities.
I have no doubt about that. No, I think it is. I'm just flagging up.
There are definitely challenges.
Just a challenge between the rhetoric. You know, diversity is strength. All this, you know, putting it on 50p coins or whatever. Yeah, fine. You can. But that's a religion. You're just saying that diversity is strength. You're not looking at the real challenges.
It's a very reckless belief. That's the way I describe it. And I think that there needs to be more of a focus on commonality, to be honest, as opposed to difference. Now, I think it's nice that people may have different heritages. They celebrate them. They need to be celebrated in a peaceful way, in an orderly way. I think that's important. But there has to be a sense of a transcendent national identity, which is able to wrap that diversity up.
I totally agree. So let's finish on solutions, what we do going forward. Now, I think there are challenges, and I think putting your head in the sand and being dishonest is not a solution. I think so many people do that. And that's why I think your book is brilliant, because you deal with it head on. But we've got to think about how we go forward, right? And the bleak. I mean, I love John Gray, and I talk about him a lot. But he talks about the United States being in a sort of low-intensity civil war, and he, you know, you could say that's possibly true. But then you can also look around the world, and you can find. In Southeast Asia, an extremely successful state that has taken on a very diverse population and united them, and that's Singapore. And Singapore, it's probably the most successful state economically, you know, in terms of what it had and what it's got in history. But it's also, Lee Kuan Yew also pulled people together, and he talked from the start. He was raised in realism because they suffered not just in Singapore, but they suffered in Kuala Lumpur before Singapore became a separate state. Internecine riots which killed a lot of people, and they knew how difficult it was. And Lee Kuan Yew said, well, you know, one of the problems we're separate communities. We just don't. And he said, we don't sing together. We can't sing together. And so he actively integrated
very robustly.
Very robust. Yeah, and I'm not saying we could always do what they do here. I mean, you know, you can't just drop and transport, particularly in very different societies. But it proves you can do it.
Yeah, I think that when you hear many Brexiteers say that we want Britain to be, was it Singapore on the Thames?
They don't understand.
But they say it from a sort of very free market libertarian perspective.
They don't understand the social market.
Well, I'd actually like that, because I think how I'd see it, you'd have higher levels of economic intervention.
Very. Good housing, good transport.
High quality public transportation networks.
Yes.
Very robust when it comes to law and order, put it that way.
Yeah.
And some would say very authoritarian approach to integration, but at least there was that effort there to understand that you need to have a robust Singaporean national identity. And I think that's the key. Yeah. And I think many of our politicians don't even talk about it. I think
they're slightly cowardly. But it's not just that. They also lack the vocabulary. They haven't thought about it.
He was a very charismatic and inspirational leader, and unfortunately, that's in very short supply in mainstream British politics.
Lee Kuan Yew's don't just appear. He's an exceptional man. But anyway, the point is, he's proved that they can do it. But you have to have some sort of robustness. You have to. The state.
You have to have that will as well.
Yeah, you want to do it, and to bring people together, but if you want to do it, you can do it. So some of the, what are your main sort of policy solutions going forward to bring people together?
Well, I think there's a great deal of focus on just fostering good relations. It needs to be more than that. So for example, the public sector equality duty, I think we need something more along the lines of a public sector integration duty. You know, public bodies, what are your plans to integrate diverse communities? How are you going to go about it? And then you can measure how a social trust in a particular area improved year on year. So you keep track of how those institutions are performing in terms of integrating diverse communities. I think that's very important. I think there's been far too much emphasis on celebrating difference or this sort of cosy liberal language. I think we need genuine, very serious action on this front, especially when it comes to integration. I think there needs to be, unfortunately, the reality is diversity has its drawbacks. And I think that, and many people will be very disappointed in terms of me suggesting this, in order to manage diversity, there needs to be robust law and order, effective neighbourhood policing. A lot of people say that's the price of diversity. Unfortunately, I think that's something that you need.
No, that's a given anyway. I think we're in the SDP. We're very keen on all citizens got to be treated on a par, and every citizen. It's one of the things that must unite people want to live in a safe neighbourhood. It's just a given. I think I was wondering if you were going to go in terms of it might be a negative thing, but it's what we would do is defund the grievance industry. That's what we would do. We would ban CRT in schools, and we would the flows of money that goes into negative.
But pseudo-intellectual as well.
Yeah,
it's very poor in an educational sense.
Yeah. And I'm not at all, daft. I know that you couldn't do an overnight thing, because all of these ideas are culturally embedded in the academy. But why is the state funding divisive projects? Just stop that. That's not helpful.
Considerable amounts of government money that we're talking about here. Well, ultimately it's taxpayers' money, let's be clear about that. And I think one thing I'd say is that there's far too many tribal opportunists operating in state institutions. Need to be rooted out.
No,
there's no two ways about it.
It's quite clear. On the broader picture, though, I think one of the we've got 5.5 million people now to work benefits, and we're importing labour quite often in an entirely immoral way. I've worked for a medical charity in Ghana. I know what the effect of uprooting a nurse in Ghana is, and I've said it before, and this is just what happens. They can't inoculate kids die. Yeah, we get a nurse, but we can't be bothered to train around people. That's just insane, isn't it?
No, absolutely. I think that I say that Britain needs to be rehabilitated after its long-standing addiction to mass immigration. And as you say, it's deeply unethical from a global justice perspective.
Totally.
You have countries far less developed and advanced than ours who invest what limited resources they have in training up their young people, and then they lose those young people to economies such as ours.
Because we can't be bothered
But we should be.
We can't. And when we get to power, it's going to change. No, because it's. I say this a lot. I think a lot of things happen because the people that run the country don't care.
They don't care.
They don't want to do it. It's not that they can't.
They're not passionate about maximising the potential of British people.
Not at all.
And I think that's a real shame. I think that if the route to future sustainable economic growth is investing in our own domestic workforce, and in terms of improving skills, I think we could have a more sophisticated education system which better promotes vocational skills.
Oh, yeah.
And that means tackling the culture of snobbery towards those much needed skills.
The whole, you need a massive tilt. I mean, the university education system is the university industrial complex. Is actually
heavily relying on the fees of international students.
It is,
and their dependents.
It is. No, it's just a Ponzi scheme. Actually, it's not just a Ponzi scheme, but it is a Ponzi scheme, and it needs. There's been. I mean, David Goodhart's right about it. You need a massive tilt towards vocational training, massive, and it's urgent. But what it irritates me about the way we do things is that the new right neoliberalism that's embedded, marinated in it. They think you can't train anyone. You think, I mean, if you had a sensible government, sort of government that we had in post-war period, Attlee or something like that, we say that's the budget for the NHS, and the budget for the NHS happens to be, 200 billion anyway. You will train sufficient doctors and sufficient medical staff and clinicians for our requirements. And you can't say you haven't got the budget for it, because you have. And that's about doing basic things that people considered, you can't do that. Planning, labour market planning, that's very left wing. You can't do that. Of course you can if you want to. You should do it. So I never buy that you can't do it.
No. If I could just make this point very quickly as well. I think with health and social care, they need to have bursaries, apprenticeships, and on-the-job training as well. I think that'd be very important. But the key thing is, for me, national self-sufficiency is a classic conservative principle.
Yeah.
But the modern Tory party doesn't have very much time for it.
It's not conservative. No, you'd have to find. I mean, we're a party of conservative left. You might find it with us. No, I totally agree with that. I think the care service thing is just chaos. I think we need to pay people more.
Yeah, they need to better
train them. Our own population will work if they're paid for it. And we need a national care service, Andy Burnham's idea. It's the only thing that would work. One of the main problems with social care is that the people it's very patchy. The universality's gone out of the window completely. So the local authorities do something, people fall between them and the trusts all over the place. Now we can talk about that. I want to just finally finish on an idea that I'm really keen on myself, and I think it's a precondition for a successful diverse society, which is civilized toleration, as I call it, of differences. And it's not easy. You aim for equality, you aim for a much more equal society. It's the alpha and omega of our party to want that. But you will have differences, and if we're going to get on, there has to be some toleration of them. Do you agree?
Well, I think that the key point for me is that Britain has a very tolerant, anti-discrimination, pro-equality mainstream. That is my view. But that tolerance shouldn't be taken advantage of. That benevolence shouldn't be exploited. And I think that we just have to be more assertive when it comes to, in my view, uncivilized practices and beliefs. We need to tackle that.
I agree, but what I'm really getting at is in the new declaration we sort of mentioned it a little bit. This what I sort of term parity maniacs who go around saying, well, that's overrepresented in there, and there's too many. And I just think, hold on, no, a mature. If you look at ancient societies, the Ottoman Turks, there were lots of different groups, and people find a way to rub along with each other by not saying, well, you've got that, we haven't, and I. That's
absolutely. I think the emphasis has to be on equality of opportunity.
Yeah,
that is, and a meritocracy, and there's definitely improvements to be made in terms of having, how do you call it, a more merit-based allocation of rewards and opportunities in modern Britain. What I'm firmly against is the equalisation of outcomes. Now, people talk. There's certain ethnic minority groups that their representation in police forces isn't reflective of their composition within the wider population. It's down to cultural values. There's some groups that relate and gravitate towards different professions. So what you say is absolutely right. We need to reject the parity maniacs, and that's the key thing. Understand why disparities exist, and we have to shatter the disparity equals discrimination paradigm. That's the key.
You're totally right about that. Well, listen, I think your book is going to serve that purpose to some extent. I think you've written something that's excellent, and I thoroughly recommend it.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me.
Cheers, Rakib. Thank you.